I'm Bill, and in this video I will be talking to you about some basic safety issues to consider when getting started in wood carving. Now let's make a start with the possibly the most obvious candidate for self-harm when you're carving, and that's with the carving tools themselves. Now when I'm carving, I like to have my tools as close as I possibly can to where I'm actually working. I'll select a selection of tools that I think I might be needing for the particular job, and I'll arrange them so I've got the handles all pointing towards me. Now this means I can easily see the different profiles of the tools, pick the one that I think suits the job in hand best, use it, I can then put it back, all very safe. Now believe it or not, this is the sort of situation where I've seen most people damage themselves, just picking the tool up and putting it down. Particularly bad if you're taking them out of a bag. That can be very dangerous. But also, if you've got them on a table like this and you just have one pointing the wrong way, you may not see it. You make a reach for this tool here, and you could very easily damage yourself quite badly on the one that's pointing the wrong way. So it's good practice just to keep all your tools arranged so that they're facing the same direction. Now once you've safely made your tool selection, take great care when you're carrying it around or holding a tool in your hand, particularly when you're not carving. I've seen on many occasions people that wear glasses pick the glasses up with the tool in their hand, go to put them on their head, and that could all go horribly wrong. So make sure, put the tool down, then put the glasses on. Makes things a lot safer. On a similar note, if you're walking around and you have a tool in your hand, maybe you start talking to somebody, it's very easy to get carried away in the conversation, start gesticulating wildly. You could do a lot of damage with that, somebody walking past. Also, you could even damage yourself. So at all times when you're holding a sharp gouge or chisel, make sure you have it under full control. Now one quick point just before we get carving with our selected tool. It's always very important to have a securely fixed piece before you get started. I do go into clamping and fixing your piece of work in much more detail in another video. When you're carving, always try and keep all your soft fleshy parts behind the sharp end of the tool. Whether working just by hand in that way, or if you're using a mallet, keep everything behind the sharp end, makes life a lot safer. Don't try and carve towards yourself like that, that could be horrendously dangerous. Also, having a very sharp tool is much safer than having a blunt one. Obviously a lot more force is used if you're pushing a blunt tool through wood, and therefore keeping your tools nice and sharp is quite important from a safety point of view. Now if you're working away, or if you're just moving a gouge or tool around and you accidentally drop it, don't, whatever you do, try and snatch it out of the air to try and save it. Just step back, let it fall. I've found this out the hard way from personal experience. If you try and catch a tool, it can quite easily go horribly wrong. So just let the tool drop. I work on a concrete floor, but I do have a piece of carpet underneath me so that if I do drop a tool, it just falls on the carpet and doesn't get damaged at all. While on the subject of dropping tools, good idea to wear boots or enclosed shoes at the very least, just in case of accident. And while on the subject of clothing as well, try to not wear anything too loose and flappy aroundy. It can get caught on your work and break a delicate sculpture, or it can get dragged into a machine and cause some damage that way. So just bear that in mind. Try and keep clothing as close to the body as possible. Stops it getting snagged on anything that you don't want it to. So moving on to other items for personal protection. The main ones I can think of are gloves, masks and eye protection, and I'll go through those individually. Gloves, it's a bit of a personal thing really. I tend not to wear gloves for protection from the sharp end of a tool. a leather glove won't stop a sharp tool at all. Now I know there are some anti-slash gloves which are supposed to be able to stop any kind of tool cutting through them. Personally, and this is just a personal point of view, I feel that it possibly could breed sloppy tool use. If you have complete control of what you're doing, there is no reason that this part of the tool should enter your flesh in any way. Now I do use a glove for a slightly different purpose. It is for protection, but it's mainly for protection from the work that I'm working on. Because I work a lot of the time with my left hand positioned either on or near the piece that I'm working on, it's quite easy for a corner of a piece of wood or a jagged part sticking out to just put a bit of damage into the skin. So I only tend to wear a left glove while I'm working on some particular pieces, but at no point do I use one to stop the sharp parts of a tool going through my skin. But as I say, that is just a personal point of view. Now, masks, but any wood dust is not a good idea to get into your lungs. So if you're doing sanding, particularly if you're sanding with a machine, power sander of any description, always really good idea to wear a suitable face mask. Also having dust extraction systems and air filters all help to keep the air clean that goes into your lungs. And finally we come to eye protection. I personally use some protective goggles like these with the wraparound sides. If I'm doing anything with power tools, or if I'm using my sharpening system, which has a rotary wheel on it that can throw bits of grit and metal into the face. Other times I might use goggles is if I'm carving a particularly hard wood and I'm using a mallet maybe. When you're working away on a particularly splintery hardwood like yew, it can throw bits straight into your face. So very important to wear goggles in any situation where you're liable to get particles into the eye. Now, one of the areas where someone is most likely to harm themselves is when using a knife of some description. Now, the best advice I can give is when you're using a knife, be very, very careful. But there are a couple of points that I can put across that may help people out. If you're working from the hand, you're holding the piece that you're carving and you're whittling away some wood from the side. Using a knife where you're pulling towards yourself like this, you're not pulling the whole thing this way. That would be extremely dangerous, because when it exits the wood, you could slash anywhere, your arm, your body. Could be quite nasty. So I'm just using a gripping action like this. I'm not bringing the thumb towards the blade, that would be very dangerous. I'm making the action work so that the thumb always misses the blade. I can then position that up to the wood and I can pull the blade through the wood quite nicely that way, and I'm always going to miss myself. There's no way I can accidentally harm myself doing that action. And you can usually position whatever the carving is in such a way so that you will always miss the thumb. Just continue around this side a bit, just to give the idea. Okay, now there's a lot of strength in the grip. It is quite a useful technique to use if you're carving in your hand in this way. And there we go. Now, I do use scalpel blades an awful lot, and one of the problems that can happen with these, and with other knives as well, is what you might call handle creep. It's when you're using a tool and you're concentrating on your carving, and this hand drifts further and further down the handle, and before you know it, you're right down at the blade end, and you can very easily cut yourself around that part of the finger there. So just take great care that you don't accidentally creep your way down the handle and cut the hand that's actually holding the blade. But basically, be careful. And in this video I should be talking to you about some of the different types of wood that I use for carving, their properties and how these properties relate to different styles of wood carving. Now this is in no way an exhaustive list, it is just a few of my personal favourites that I've settled on over the last 25 years or so. I also use timber that is from a local and/or renewable source, and I thoroughly recommend that you explore the different options that are available where you are. Now the first wood I'd like to talk about is lime. Now lime is a very popular wood for carving. It was the favourite wood of the famous Dutch carver Grinling Gibbons back in the 17th century. Now it's very light in colour, and this helps if you're carving detail. It doesn't help if a wood is dark and heavily patterned. If you're trying to put fine detail into it, you can't see the detail amongst the coloration of the wood. Lime though is a very even colour, so it casts a shadow. The shadows can be seen very easily from any detail that you do carve, and it therefore stands out better. It is also very fine grained. The grain is very close together, so it will accommodate very fine detail, and most of my very detailed bird carvings are carved from lime. Now another very common tree here in the UK is plane tree, and this has some nice characteristics. It's very fine grained, so it will take detail well, but you may not want to put too much detail in because it does conflict with the rather marvellous figuring within the grain, which has led to the wood being called lacewood. Now this is just a piece of rough sawn timber, and you can see in there is some really rather nice patterning going on. Excellent wood. We go to the complete opposite end of that spectrum, and we have boxwood, possibly one of the finest grained woods that I've ever carved. Generally this is how pieces of boxwood might be got hold of. It's a very, very slow growing tree, never gets to any great size. With boxwood, because it's got such a tight, close grain and an even colour as well, you can carve very, very small pieces. This is a very tiny dog head that was carved to be cast in silver for a silver dog whistle, and you can get an idea of the sort of scale that you can work at with box. Very difficult to carve any large items from it. Also, it's extremely hard. Box, brilliant for carving very, very fine work. And walnut is a beautiful wood for carving. It has a moderately dense grain, so it will take detail, but it doesn't lend itself to fine detail. Two main reasons. One, it has a beautiful figuring within the grain, wonderful swirling patterns, especially if you get a piece that has some burr associated with it. Wonderful patterns there. Also, it's a dark colour, so it doesn't show the shadows so well with a fine detailed piece, but it does lend itself very nicely for more abstract, more stylised, smooth, flowing forms, and it does carve extremely well. Now for the last in my selection of personal favourites, I'm going to group several types of wood together under one name, and this is the fruit woods. Now most of the fruit woods share similar characters. They're fine grained generally. This is a piece of apple. Now apple can be a very even colour like this. It can also have a lot of patterning and coloration in it. It does depend on which tree and what part of the tree you're using. But generally they are beautiful woods, and they can create the most amazing pieces. Now other fruit woods such as pear is very good. Cherry is excellent as well. I've carved some damson in the past, and that had some beautiful purples running through it, so a lovely wood. This piece here is carved from a piece of pear, and it just gives you an idea of the sort of size pieces that it suits itself to. And as you can see with this one, it's an even colour, so you can see the shadows within the piece quite nicely, and it does show the details up. And that brings my short list of favourites to a close. Firstly, you will need a few carving tools. Now the type of tool and the number you have will depend on the type of carving that you want to do, and also its size. But a basic setup, I would recommend some kind of large gouge, a medium-sized gouge, a smaller gouge, a Vtol, very useful those are, a flat chisel, and then finally some kind of a knife. Now this is a homemade variety, and this is an off-the-shelf scalpel. Very useful for the finer details. Now with this simple setup, there is an awful lot that you can achieve. Almost as important as your tools is finding an efficient way of safely holding your project while you work on it. Now obviously there is a certain amount you can do, holding in one hand and carving with a knife or small tools in the other, but it is far safer and saves a lot more time if you can find some way to hold your work securely. Now I shall run through a few options that I've used myself over the years. Now the first method I'm going to show you for holding your work still is possibly one of the simplest methods, and it's by using anti-slip mat. It's also known as router matting, and this just goes down on a flat surface and then your work goes on top. Now this is particularly useful if you're going to be doing some relief carving. Now once that's on there, the friction holds that in place as long as you've got a little bit of downward force while you're working on it, and then you can work on that quite nicely. Now another option that can work quite well, that is a bit similar to the anti-slip mat, is a sandbag. And this is a leather one, but it deforms nicely to more awkward shapes. Doesn't have to have a flat bottom to it, whatever it is that you're carving. And then that just helps secure the piece while you're working on it. Now moving on to something a little more robust. If you can get hold of some kind of a vise, this can be very useful. Here I have an engineering vise that's been bolted quite securely to a separate piece of wood, and this gives me some versatility to it. I can fit that to any bench with a G-clamp, like that, and this gives me lots of options. It means that you don't have to permanently have something fitted to a bench if you don't want to do that, and then your work can just fit into that in that way, and you can work on it with both hands concentrating on what you're doing, as opposed to trying to hold it in one hand and work on it with the other. Now the vise system that I've just shown you is very versatile, but there are many more dedicated types of clamp designed specifically for woodcarvers out there, and this is one of them. This particular one I have screwed to a large piece of wood, and this allows me to fit it into a vise that is bolted to the side of my workbench here. I can fit that securely there, and then this comes with a separate table, and this is then screwed directly onto your wood carving, and as they say, this one I have prepared earlier. So that then fits inside the clamping mechanism. Once that is locked off, that's really very solid, won't move anywhere, and again you can use both hands to work quite comfortably on this particular piece. Now you can do other things with this type of clamp. You can, if you want, just screw one of the tables to a flat piece of wood, and then you can fit that in and again operate it at any angle that you want, and you could perhaps put the sandbag back on there, and again you can work in that fashion. So the main thing about holding your work firmly is versatility and being able to improvise with what you have at hand. Another extremely important part of carving is keeping your tools nice and sharp. Now there are many ways of creating a sharp edge on your tools. A lot of it depends on how much money you want to spend, but I shall go through some of the various options that I'm most familiar with. Now I'm going to start off by showing you the simplest way of sharpening a tool that I'm going to show you today. And this is with some kind of a stone. Now it can be an oil stone or a whetstone. This is a type of whetstone, it's a diamond stone. And one of the reasons I prefer a whetstone to an oil stone is the oil can sometimes stay on the tool after you've finished and then make its way onto your piece of wood when you're carving it and stain the wood quite badly on occasions. So that's why I like to use a whetstone. A little bit of water is involved on this. And then what I'll be doing is I'm grinding the outside edge of the tool in a figure of 8 motion to creep up slowly towards the cutting edge of the tool. And once I've got close to the edge, or once I've got to the edge, I'll feel very carefully with my thumbnail down to the end to see if I can feel the burr. Now as I'm applying the tool to the stone, I'm rolling it from side to side to cover the full width of this particular gouge. Obviously with a shallower gouge you wouldn't have to roll it from side to side quite so much. And then I'll feel up to the edge, see if I can feel the burr, and once you can feel the burr, then, and you do have to take great care doing that so you don't cut yourself, then you dry the tool off and basically polish off the burr from the inside. Now the simplest way of doing that is with a piece of leather that has been impregnated with a metal polishing compound, and you literally just stroke the inside of the tool with that, and that will polish off that burr and leave you with a nice sharp tool. Now the system that I use for sharpening myself, and have done actually for over 20 years now, is a 2-wheeled system. It's basically based on a bench grinder. On the right hand side is a very fine abrasive wheel. On the left hand side is a polishing mop just like the one that was in the drill a bit earlier. And the theory is exactly the same. I'll create the burr on the right hand side here by applying the tool to the abrasive stone, and then I'll polish that burr off on the polishing mop on the other side. Now another feature of this particular type of system is having a light. It's very important. It does help tremendously to see the burr when it's been kicked up on the edge of the tool. So you're grinding up to the edge, the burr comes up, and you can see a very fine line of light along the edge of the tool. And then once you've got that, you know it's time to come over and polish that burr off, and you end up with a very nice sharp tool. Now I should just put it into practice just so you can see how it operates. Very important to wear goggles. Slow that down. And yes, I nearly forgot the goggles. Very important because the stone can kick up some grit and that could go in your eye. So very important to wear the goggles when you're using a system like that. But very efficient, and once I've used this tool for a little while, it'll start to dull off a little bit, and then all I'll do is go back to the polishing mop, a couple of seconds on that, and you're back in action with a very sharp tool. So very important, keep your tool sharp and enjoy the wood carving. Now in this video I shall be talking to you about a variety of carving tools that are available, particularly the ones that I tend to use the most myself. Obviously the tools that you may want to use will vary depending on what it is that you want to carve. But I shall now go through some of the major types and show you how I might make use of their differences. Now we're going to start off nice and simply with what we call a flat chisel. Now I'll need to go through the numbering system on tools, and it does vary a little bit, but the general idea is about the same. There's 2 numbers that are usually associated with a tool. One relates to how curved or how flat the profile or the sweep of the tool is called. And the other number relates to the width of the tool. So the numbering scheme generally runs from 1 being a flat tool up to any number around about 10 into double figures, which will be a very tightly curved one. So this is a flat chisel, as we would call it, and that is a number 9, which has got quite a sweep to it. But with the flat chisel, this is what would be called a straight flat chisel, i.e. it's got straight sides to it. And here we have another flat chisel, and this one has a slightly different numbering system on it. It's got a 1 for being flat, an F for fishtail, and the 20 is in millimeters, and that's the width of the blade at the end there. Now fishtail, obviously it looks a bit like the tail of a fish. It's quite self-explanatory. The difference in use, it's quite useful having a fishtail sometimes because they get into corners much better because you don't have the sides of the tool interfering with where you're trying to get the tip of your tool to. Now the uses for flat tools is varied. I tend to use them quite a lot if I'm just rounding over a convex surface, so anything where the curve is going around that way, I would tend to use a flat tool for, and it rounds around quite nicely. And if you wanted to do a concave surface, then you would be more likely to use a gouge. So that's the flat tool. We'll be coming back to the flat tool a bit later on as well. Now they come in various sizes, obviously. This is a much larger one. The way I tend to use a lot of my tools is I'm always resting one of my hands on or near the piece of work, and I'll grip the tool in that hand, and as I push something like a flat tool through, I will slide it from one side of the tool to the other, and that adds a slicing action, and it helps the blade go through the wood as opposed to just directly pushing it. It doesn't cut quite as cleanly as it would do if you use a slight slicing action. So very good for rounding edges over. If I want to wrap this leaf that I'm carving here over the edge of the piece of wood, I would just use this flat tool to do that. Doing that with a gouge would leave lots of facets and divots in it, so it wouldn't be quite as effective as a flat tool for doing that job. Now one of the other very useful tools is a Vtol. Now as the name implies, it's V in shape or in profile, has a slightly different numbering system, which I won't go into, but it will relate to the width of the tool as well, but also the degree angle inside here. So this may be something like a 55 or something like that. You can get them 90 degrees and 45 degrees is a very useful tool to have. And I use Vtols a lot for outlining something like a relief, like this leaf. And once I've outlined something, I can then drop the wood away that I don't want. So I'm dropping the background of where this leaf is going to be. And for this job, I will use some kind of a gouge. Now this is, what is this? This is a number 7. So this is a sort of middle of the road sort of size gouge. It's not as deep as a number 10 would be, or it's not as curved as a number 10 would be. And this would probably be, what it says, 14 on it. So it's a 14mm wide tool. And it's a number 7 sweep. Anyway, you get the idea. So I can drop this bit away. Obviously very important to keep your tools nice and sharp. And as soon as the edge starts to go, then it's time to hone it. Don't necessarily have to resharpen with a stone every time you start to lose an edge on your tool, just a quick whiz on your buffing system, as I have here. That's all it takes usually. I tend to wipe it on myself, get any dirt off the tool, and that's already much sharper than it was a couple of seconds ago. Now Vtols, as I was showing you just now, I'm just going to take this area down a little bit further, just to show that in action again. And what you can do with a Vtol, as I'm just beginning to do here, is you can lean it over to one side and use one side of it, much like a flat chisel. Just saves changing tool constantly. The more you can sort of improvise and do more than one job with any particular tool, the better. Now I've just been working away at this for a little bit just to get it to a point where I can show you some other tools. Now we're actually at an interesting point where it will demonstrate where a fishtail is more useful than a straight-sided tool in some situations. So I want to remove some of this wood under here, and I can't really get the angle in to access this wood that I want to remove at the base of where the part of that leaf is. Whereas the fishtail, this one here, and this is a fishtail gouge of the number 7, it gets in there quite nicely, and you can see this part has been cut away, and it means I can access the bottom of where that stem is coming up quite nicely. Now I've chosen a leaf to be just demonstrating on here because obviously the theme for this year's World Wood Day is wood and CO2. And of course it's all about the way that timber captures CO2 from the atmosphere through the process of photosynthesis, which predominantly happens in the leaves. Now I haven't mentioned mallets. I tend to use my hands a lot for working around a piece like this, but there's no reason why you can't use a mallet for certain parts. Removing some of the bulk of the wood here would be quite useful. Sorry, I'm getting in the way of my camera here. So you can use a mallet that way. A lot of people think it's purely for bulk wood removal. That's not necessarily the case. It's quite possible to remove wood quicker without a mallet than if you're actually using one. But an area where mallets are very useful is where you need a lot of control. So if I'm wanting to remove some of this wood here, carving in this direction, and I want to maintain this feature here, if I'm doing it by hand, I've got to be very careful not to accidentally overshoot the mark and dig the tool into the area that I'm wanting to preserve if you're pushing hard with your body behind the tool. But if you're using a mallet, you can be very gentle, and you don't have the same amount of momentum following through with the tool. So they're actually really useful for the most delicate bits. But obviously different carvers have their own different ways. Now you can see I'm doing something here. It looks like I'm carving towards myself. I am carving towards myself, but I have complete control of the tool because I've gripped it with this hand and I've hooked the hand over the piece of work there. So there's no way, although the blade is coming towards me, there's no way that I can overshoot. If I was doing that, that would be very, very dangerous. Now, let's remove some of this. Now we're getting to an area where one of the, what I might call, speciality tools might come in handy. And to access into this corner, I'm trying to get in there a bit with the Vtol, and it's getting there, but it's not getting right into the corner. But if I was to use an angle tool, this is a flat tool, but it's got an angle cut into the blade, and that can give me very good access into these sort of tight corners. Come at it from 3 directions, from that way, and then across the bottom, and then free that bit of wood up. There's a really nice, clean corner. So, very useful tool is the flat angle tool. I do use that quite a bit. Going through the gouges, now they come in different sizes. This is a number 9. It says 9 there. It's probably about a 3/4 of an inch, something like that. And I'm wanting to put a bit of shape now into this leaf. Now I've exposed it a bit from the wood, so I want to come down in the middle there a bit. And you can see with this gouge, I'm doing a similar thing to what I was doing with the flat tool. Instead of slicing it from side to side as I was with the flat tool, I'm rotating the gouge as I push it through the wood. And that means it cuts much cleaner than if I was just doing a completely straight push, just trying to push it through the wood. So the thing I like to envisage is if I'm cutting a loaf of bread and I'm just pushing the bread knife down through the loaf, you tend to just squash the loaf. But if you slide the bread knife backwards and forwards through the bread, it cuts through it cleanly. It's very similar with any kind of cutting blade, really. So a little bit of a slice on the action means you're having to use less force to push the tool through the wood. Now I'm just putting a bit of variation, a bit of undulation on this leaf that I'm doing. This is a sycamore leaf, by the way. And it's not worth drawing on all the fine veins and other bits and pieces that are going to go on the leaf, because we're putting shape on it. So I shall wait until I've got near to the shape that I'm aiming for, and then I might draw in the fine vein work, and then we'll be working around those with some of the smaller tools, which I shall be tackling in just a little while. Now, one tool that I might just mention at this point is a spoon gouge. Now, a spoon gouge is quite good at getting into concave areas like this. And this is what it looks like. It's basically changed the angle of attack. To get the same angle of attack of where the blade actually is, I would have to hold this tool at that angle. Now, if you're getting down into a hollow, it would mean that this part of the blade would be impinging on the wood there. So a bent gouge or a spoon gouge can get into these areas quite nicely, because I'll be holding the handle a lot higher to get the same angle of attack for the blade into the wood. Now, not something that I use an awful lot, but every now and then they have their definite uses. Okay. Now, this is another type of bent gouge. A lot of these sort of more speciality tools, they have limited uses, but when you do need them, they can save time. It doesn't necessarily mean you can't do a job because you don't have the right tool. It just means that it might take a bit longer to achieve the same effect. Now I'm just going to carry on with this for a bit, and hopefully you can come back when I'm ready to put a little bit more detail in. So welcome back. Been doing a little bit more detail on this. Got a bit more undulation in the leaf, a bit more ups and downs, and I've marked in the fine veins. And I'm just going to talk to you a little bit now about some different types of gouges. One of them is called a veiner, or some people will call it a veiner. Now what this is, it's a veiner, is this one here. It has higher sides than an ordinary gouge, and it's good for getting into deeper recesses without the corners of the tool fouling in the wood and lifting grain up that you don't want it to. Very useful tool is the veiner. I'm going to use a very small one now. It's a 3mm number 11 sweep. So I'm going to come either side of these lines that I put in. Now obviously very important to make sure that your tools are very sharp when you're doing this kind of work. And don't be too worried about crossing over the line that you've done and cutting through the vein. All you need to do is just go a little bit deeper and you can recover quite easily. Often with carving, you got a few more bites at the cherry, so to speak, than you might initially think. A lot of my students in the past have started off being very fearful of removing too much wood. Removing too much wood is just as bad as removing not enough. And I would favour that people learnt and improved. And the only way to do that is to really get stuck in there and give it a go. So, I haven't gone as close as I'm going to go to those lines straight off. I'm just sort of roughing them in, and then that gives me the opportunity of coming alongside them in a little bit and creeping even closer to the final line that I want. But you can see here how useful this very small gouge, this small veiner is for going either side of the veins of this leaf. Now once I've dropped down either side, obviously I need to remove the wood that's filling this area here. So what I'd need there is a smaller gouge, really. This one would be a bit too big. I could do quite a bit with that, I suppose. Again, being a fishtail, I can get the corner of it in, and I can get that pretty close to the sides of those veins, and the same on that side. Drop that down, that bit there, and that will leave those veins proud. We don't want them as divots into the leaf. They're actually proud, positive marks. They're not just simply grooves in the wood. This is doing the job okay, but a smaller tool might be useful at some point. There we go. As you can see, I've switched to a smaller tool for sorting out the area between the veins on this leaf. And this is actually one of my favourite little tools. Actually, it's a very small fishtail gouge, and it's very good for getting into these little areas. One of the problems with fishtail gouges is they do have a limited lifespan because of the shape. I'll just use this one here. As you sharpen this, it will get shorter and shorter and shorter over a period of time, and of course the width of the tool will get narrower and narrower as it goes on. With the straight-sided tools, obviously the longevity is much greater with those than with a fishtail, but there's good and bad points on both sides really. Now this could be a sanded piece maybe. I'm just going to tool it, and I'm going to leave the final tool marks to give the impression of the very, very fine veins that you have in a leaf such as this. And obviously being this is just a relief carving, I'm going to undercut it to a degree, and the undercutting is very important because that creates lots of shadow and elevates the piece from the background. Undercutting, I'd probably start off with something like a Vtol, just laid on its side. So I'm putting the one side of the Vtol flat against the base, and just start the process of getting under there. Now what can often happen, sometimes people like to go around a relief carving, hammering around the outside to give the outline, but you have very little control over how deep the tool goes. And then when it comes to undercutting, you can discover where the tool has gone too deep initially. It leaves a cut line in the wood that's visible once you've started undercutting underneath the leaves. So that's why I like to go around the outside edge with a Vtol, because there's no chance of accidentally going too deep. Now, once I've gone so far with the Vtol, I would switch to some kind of a knife. Again, started off just laid flat on its side, and scoring under there. And then very important when you're using a knife in this way and you're undercutting something, that you don't, again, overshoot the cut and leave a long-term mark in the wood beyond where you want to be. So that comes out there quite nicely. Another type of knife that I use a lot for this sort of job is a scalpel, and these are very nice because the blade is extremely thin and it doesn't push the fibres of the wood apart, it cuts through the fibres, especially where you have an area like this little stem here. I want to undercut it a bit. In fact, I want to go right the way through at the point where it lifts up at that point there, and the grain of the wood is running this direction, which is completely wrong really. I want it ideally running that way, as it will give much more strength to that piece there, but it's perfectly possible to do it this way around. And what you have to be careful of is when you're dealing with short areas where you're going across the grain, it can split the wood out very easily. So using something that cuts the fibres as opposed to something that acts more like a wedge is a definite advantage. Yeah. Now, getting back onto the tools, with that set that I've sort of run through there, you can carve an awful lot with those. Some slightly more unusual tools that I do own but are very, very rarely used are ones like this. This is some kind of a back bent skewed gouge. I've used it very rarely, but when I've used it, it's come in handy for getting round the back of something, but it's not the be all and end all of having a tool like that. And as for this one here, I don't think I've ever used it. One day there may be some use for that one, but yeah, it's not worth wasting your money buying large sets of tools. I find it much better if you have a few tools and then build up your collection as you decide or you discover which ones you actually get on with and which ones you actually need. That one was bought many years ago, before I really understood what it was that I actually needed for carving. Very basic set, you can do an awful lot with. It has been my great pleasure to have taken part in World Wood Day in the past. And again, it has been an honour to have taken part, even under this year's unusual circumstances. So you have some wood, some tools, a way of sharpening them, and a way of holding your work still. All you need now is some inspiration. And perhaps if you look around the World Wood Day website, you might find some. Thanks for watching.